Hey there, this is Phil Vischer. Welcome to the Holy Post Podcast. I am here with Christian Taylor.
Hey there, Phil Vischer.
Hi, Christian Taylor. And Sky Jitani.
Hello.
Hi. And we have Jason Rugg manning the controls. How you doing, Jason?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Super good. And Julie is listening silently off to the side, taking notes. Thanks, Julie. How's everybody? Sky, anything interesting? It's been 2 weeks since we recorded. Anything interesting in your life? Really? Wow. Okay. Christian,
I'm trying to think.
You got anything? A PPP. I mean, that's a good thing.
You got a PPP. Do you need a PPP?
Me? Yeah.
Oh yeah. I'm grateful for that. I was sharing before we recorded that a lot of my travel for the fall is up in the air because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And that's a little scary given that I have to pay for a daughter going to college. So yes, I got the PPP loan to hopefully fill in the gaps if necessary.
That's good. And Christian, any movie news? Anything interesting?
Yeah, I mean, last week we got a handful of rejections from film festivals, which were a little painful. So we've been accepted to 1 and then rejected from about 10. So, I mean, it's a terrible percentage. We're happy for that one. And then we did get a distribution deal offered. And so, we have to talk about that today.
Okay.
I doubt there will be one that we will sign, but I mean, that's encouraging.
Uh-huh.
That we got that. So.
Uh-huh. Okay. Hey Phil, what was your highlight for the last 2 weeks? Well, thank you for asking. What was my highlight? We had some good pool time with my granddaughter, which is always fun.
It's so weird for me to hear you say that. Seriously.
Yeah, my granddaughter. Yeah, my granddaughter and my grandson, but he's so little. He's little tiny. He's so cute though. Nothing much else. I turned in the first draft for a new VeggieTales movie. I got notes back. I'm starting in on the second draft. I actually like the movie. I hope it would get made someday, but who knows? You never know with movies. What is a movie anymore? It's just, didn't get bought by Netflix thing, so it ends up in a theater somewhere. I don't know even what a movie is, but we'll see if we can make something good. And here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay. All right. We had last week, we talked about Antifa. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah. Antifa.
Well, we didn't talk about Antifa.
Yeah,
Sorry.
we don't know how to say it. Antifa. No, it was a story by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times about Antifa hysteria sweeping America and all these small towns where social media reports where busloads of Antifa warriors are coming to kill people, and then everyone shows up with their guns, and then no busloads show up. And a few people took exception to that story, more than usual for one of our stories, and basically said, you guys aren't taking the threat of Antifa seriously. They're doing lots of bad things, and it's very dangerous. And not sure what I was going from in saying that it seems to be overblown. This is what... the article. The article.
Before you go into the article, can we just define our terms right here for a moment? So I have to admit, I'm not incredibly educated on Antifa or its ways. I do know that it is a left-wing group. So for those of us who aren't really educated, can you talk to us a little bit about Antifa?
Well, it's not as much of an actual group as Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is an actual group with an ideology and a website, and there are chapters around the country. There are official Black Lives Matter chapters, and then there are unofficial Black Lives Matter chapters. So that seems to be a more official thing. Antifa is people that show up whenever there's a right-wing demonstration and counter-protest, and they've had a propensity to get violent, and fist fights often break out. and that became, it's kind of become a major focus for the far right of, there's this really sinister group that's rising up and is violent, and they're really, really bad. And the president has picked it up, and other right-wing Fox News has picked it up. The point of the Nicholas Kristof piece was that I think they're like 40 towns now have had reported, we're about to be invaded by Antifa. We need to protect our town. And nothing ever happened. They were all false, narratives. In the unrest so far, as through June 17th, which was when this article was written, no one who faced serious federal charges during the protests or the riots had any connection or claimed any connection with Antifa. So there just doesn't seem to have been much Antifa activity in this last round of unrest.
Phil, that just shows how subtle and secretive they really are.
Ooh, here's a little snark from Sky.
But it's always good to have a boogeyman. Every movement needs a boogeyman, and Antifa is filling that purpose right now for some folks.
Yeah.
I do so many people that I respect. Why are they so certain that there is this large organized group that's really ready to take over?
Well, it's been more present in Portland and the Pacific Northwest. There's been more stuff happening over there. In the rest of the country, we haven't seen anything. There's like nothing, in this area. In the middle of the country, so it's hard to see it as a thing. If you watch it, so the right wing media has picked up more on those images of people from the Pacific Northwest and has made it feel like it. I think it's just that it's a bigger thing than it actually is.
One of the things I like to do when I'm bored and feeling like I need to be upset at the world is I will go on more progressive news websites and look at what their top headline stories are. And then I will go to more conservative websites and look at what their top news headlines are. And last week provided a really interesting juxtaposition. So I forget which site it was. Maybe it was New York Times or Washington Post, something like that. But they were leading off with a story about accusations that Russian soldiers were paying, or Russian agents were paying Afghan soldiers bounties to kill U.S. troops, and that the Trump administration knew about this and had done nothing. That was kind of the lead stories over there, and it was pages and pages of all that. And then I flipped over to Fox News, and their website had nothing on any. I scrolled all the way down to the bottom of the page. They had nothing on that story whatsoever. But the whole first top of the page was all about Antifa activists in Seattle and Portland, and images of graffiti and violence that. So you can see why, if you live in one ecosystem of news versus another, you see the world completely differently.
Yeah. And so people have accused us of being our own echo chamber because we don't have voices on the show that strongly disagree with us.
I strongly disagree with you guys sometimes. Christian strongly disagrees with most news of the butt.
That's for sure.
And my general...
I quietly disagree with everying. So,
thank you, Jason.
Yeah, just so
thank
you know.
you. I knew there was a dissenting voice out there.
Well,
I just didn't realize it was on mute.
We have had people on, like the atheists, who disagree with us.
Yeah, but my point going back is that it's not a debate show. It's not a show where I'm trying. Now we're going to have someone come in and I am going to explain how wrong they are to their face. So if we significantly disagree with a position, we're not going to put it on the show, because we're not going to let. I mean, I'm not going to promote an idea that I find significantly harmful or objectionable.
I think it's also worth pointing out that there is a lot of Christian media out there, whether radio or podcasts or TV shows, that take a stridently Republican conservative point of view on whatever the issue of the day might be. We do sometimes, but we also offer other points of view. And so in and of itself, the show may not be balanced because we bring in opposing guests, but we're partly to balance out what I think a lot of people have absorbed from predominant Christian media for a long time, and all the while hanging to a theologically orthodox point of view.
Yeah. That's the goal, is to be theologically orthodox, but not beholden to any particular political party or particular ideology.
Right.
Which is something that we're specifically reacting against in the kind of the Christian world today.
Well, while you were talking about nobody under federal indictment has been directly linked to Antifa, and there's also been no accusations of someone from Antifa killing anybody.
Right.
Unlike white supremacist groups and others who have. But other things just to keep in mind, if you're really worried about Antifa coming after you or your family or destroying, killing people, every year on average, 13 people are killed by vending machines, 12 people are killed by selfies. 450 people die annually from falling out of their own bed and breaking their necks. Volcanoes kill over 700 people every year. Coconuts kill 150 people a year. So
I knew I didn't trust coconuts.
Yeah. So anyway, there are a lot of things to be afraid of in this world, and we could make any one of them our boogeyman if we really wanted to.
Let's start a news network that's all about fear of coconuts.
Coconuts is also a racially charged term.
Oh, no, I did it.
It is. Yeah.
For what group?
I don't even know what it means.
I've heard it around South Asian communities where coconuts are referred to as people who are brown on the outside but white on the inside.
Oh,
wow.
Great. I thought that was an Oreo.
No, that's black on the outside, white on the inside. Coconut is brown on the outside, white on the inside.
We have a question from a listener, Christiana. Just asked this question this morning, and I thought it was interesting. Referring to the Barna discussion on how white Christians view the gospel, I'd love Sky to share the difference between how parents or churches of different ethnicities share the gospel to their kids. What's the difference between a white Protestant presentation of the gospel and other presentations? Do you have any knowledge of how non-white churches or families present the gospel to their kids?
I have no personal knowledge of that. I mean, I could talk about how I've talked about the gospel to my own kids, but it's not by any means representative of another ethnic stream of the church or something. I can't speak to that. It's not my experience. And this isn't to say that only white churches make theological errors or have theological blind spots. Every church does, every tradition does, every culture does. So this is not an indictment of white Christianity in any.
Yeah, she does say, what is the difference between a white Protestant presentation and other presentations that lead you to pinpoint our racial resentment as a group? And I think that's a connection that was not in our story. But generally speaking, I mean, Christian, you were the kind of case of, I think we talked about this last week, where I asked you what was the gospel you heard as a little girl in your church, and you talked about your personal salvation. And that's the idea of limiting to the gospel to one's personal salvation leads to a hyper-individualistic view of sin, and therefore the solution to sin is also hyper-individualistic. It doesn't leave room for a systemic or cultural or societal level of injustice in your imagination. So historically, the Black Christian experience, and this is not coming from my personal knowledge, but from my study, has always included both the personal need for reconciliation with God, the forgiveness of your sins, but also a recognition of social or corporate injustice, which is where you get some liberation theology and some of that there is a larger deliverance. And it's partly why so much of Black Christianity, going all the way back to the antebellum South, used the story of deliverance from Egypt as a core narrative, because it wasn't just about personal salvation. It was about the whole community being saved from slavery. And a lot of Western white Christianity downplays that biblical narrative and plays up individual salvations. So different communities with different histories will take different aspects of the Bible and emphasize or de-emphasize them based on their experience.
Let me ask you this. I do think that there's another very large difference between the Black American Christian experience and the white one, and that is based on the suffering that was experienced during the time of slavery. And I think their spiritual formation was forged in that, oppressive, suffering environment, which the white Christian church did not experience here in America. And I think it's really difficult for us to understand what that's like when you aren't in that kind of suffering.
Sure. I have a great book on my shelf here called Slave Religion that I've referred to many, many times in my own writing and studying. It's just a remarkable book. But you got to understand, this isn't just a black and white thing. It's not just a white American versus African American kind of dynamic, but it's a dynamic between Christians who are in power, who then use their faith to maintain the status quo, and Christians who are not in power or who are persecuted, who see their faith as a correction to the status quo. So where you find yourself in the power dynamic in different societies deeply shapes the way you understand your faith. And that's where I think the core fault line exists, is do you want the world to basically be maintained or even go back to an earlier era, or do you see the world as broken and needing to be changed? And that's interesting when you read like a book like Revelation, which we had Juan Hernandez on a few weeks ago to talk about this. It was written to a persecuted minority group of Christians who longed for the world to be changed. When you suddenly find yourself in power as Christians, you have to fundamentally reinterpret the book of Revelation to justify you being in power and the world not changing. So that takes a whole different viewpoint on the way you read scripture, the way you understand the gospel. It becomes about individual salvation rather than the recreation of the world. So yeah, it's a lot about power, not just race.
Well, as a Christian who's been in the church for a really long time, I have to honestly say, I don't know that I've done a lot of deep thinking about this power, divide. Do we do a lot of teaching? Have I just missed that? Because what you're saying to me are new concepts that I should be considering.
Well, part of it comes just from knowing church history. The way the church operated, even theologically, prior to Constantine is very different than the post-Constantinian church. Constantine was the 4th century emperor of Rome who became a Christian and made Christianity legal throughout the Roman Empire. So once Christianity found itself in power, its theology dramatically changed from what it was before, when it was just a rebellious, outlawed sect in the Roman Empire. Like, for example, prior to Constantine, we didn't have anything like a just war theory. There was no doctrine of warfare for Christianity because Christians didn't fight wars. They weren't in power to fight wars. Once you are the emperor and you're a Christian and you have to fight wars, you suddenly have to come up with a doctrine or theology for justifying warfare. That's the difference between out of power and in power. And that's continued throughout Christian history. And you see it in black theology versus white American theology. You see it in conservative politics versus progressive liberal politics. It continues to ferment depending not just on race, but where you stand in the power structure of the society.
And you see some of that in the last election, in the difference between the Mormon response to Donald Trump and the white evangelical response to Donald Trump.
Great example.
Where you have almost exactly the same social concerns, almost the exact same moral concerns. But white evangelicals were willing to say, we'll overlook everything that's bad about this guy because we think that he'll help us on these 10 counts. And Mormons, by and large, said, no, we're not overlooking what's bad about this guy. We can't support him in any way. Mormons are used to being on the outside looking in. White evangelicals are used to being on the inside looking out. And that's been one of our motivating, as a white evangelical, that's been one of our motivating fears in the last 50 years, is that we're getting kicked out. We're getting kicked out of power. We're losing our privileged status. Well, Mormons have never had that issue. So whereas part of Trump's appeal was saying to white evangelicals, I will help you reclaim your privilege, your status, and we'll keep it from failing, the war on Christmas, the war on you name it. For Norman the Mormon, he's my favorite Mormon. For Mormons, that has never been an issue because they've never had that. They've never been on the inside. So they were, in a sense, much more able to think, I don't know if I want to say clearly, but say, no, these are our values and we're going to stick to our values because we don't have anything, to a certain extent, we don't have anything tremendous. We're not nearly as tempted to compromise our values to get what we want because we're not going to get anything. So we're going to stick with our values. And white evangelicals were much more likely to say, as Robert Jeffress said, we need a bully. We need a bully to fight for us because we are under attack. Well, Mormons have been literally physically under attack since the religion was formed in America. So it's like, of course we're under attack. We're always under attack. Have you seen the Book of Mormon, the show on Broadway? We've been under attack since day one. And it's the same thing with black Protestants. They're much less likely to say, we'll vote for this guy if he will help us retain our privileged position in society, because we've never had a privileged position in society. So we are easier to compromise because of our fear of losing our privilege because we had it in the first place, if that makes sense. Okay, can I move on? Good.
Move on.
Anyone? Any questions? David French, our friend David French, we need to get him on the podcast because he's, in the words of Christian, he's really knocking it out of the park these days. He wrote a piece on July 5th called "America is in the Grips of a Fundamentalist Revival," and it's worth doing a deeper dive into. The title is "America's in the Grips of a Fundamentalist Revival, but it's not Christian." And this is fascinating. He describes his own, he's an evangelical Christian. He says, "I've participated in church services and prayer meetings where we all prayed fervently for revival. We cried out for another great awakening. I thought I would actually never see that happen in my lifetime, a true large-scale religious awakening. But here it is. Here we are. There's just one catch. It's not Christian. It is, however, quite fundamentalist." And then he talks about what some people are describing as the Great Awakening, a direct callback to arguably the most significant Christian religious revival of our nation's past. And the point of the article is he's describing the political religious fervor that's happening on the extreme ends of our public discourse. He starts out by talking about the fervor on the far left, where he quotes John McWhorter, who's writing in The Atlantic, describing the religious elements of what McWhorter calls third wave anti-racism. Did you miss the first two waves of anti-racism? I didn't have my surfboard yet. I think they went right. Anyway, apparently we're now on the third wave of anti-racism, and it's the biggest, best wave. You got to catch it. Third wave anti-racism is a profoundly religious movement in everything but terminology. The idea that whites are permanently stained by their white privilege, gaining moral absolution only by eternally attesting to it, is the third wave's version of original sin. The idea of a someday when America will come to terms with race is as vaguely specified a guidepost as Judgment Day. Explorations as to whether an opinion is problematic are equivalent of explorations of that which may be blasphemous. The social mauling of the person with problematic thoughts parallels the excommunication of the heretic. What is called virtue signaling then channels the impulse that might lead a Christian to an aggressive display of his or her faith in Jesus. So basically saying, and it's funny because it sounds like this would be, kind of a voice from the far right saying, the left is crazy. All this anti-racism stuff is its own religion. And this is, in the Atlantic. So it's a liberal publication to start out with. And then he pulls in, David French pulls in Andrew Sullivan, who we've talked about before. Is he Catholic?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's conservative Catholic and also gay. An interesting fellow. Doesn't quite fit in anybody's box, but he's writing about intersectionality, which is part of the more far left liberal orthodoxy. And he talks about intersectionality operating like Orwell would describe as a smelly little orthodoxy, manifesting itself almost as a religion. It posits a classic orthodoxy through which all of human experience is explained. To overcome your sin, this original sin of being the white majority, you need to confess, i.e. check your privilege, and subsequently live your life and order your thoughts in a way to keep this sin at bay. The sin goes so deep into your psyche, especially if you're white or male or straight, that a profound conversion is required. So it's basically describing how the far left is becoming religious in demanding compliance with orthodoxy. in the same way that historically fundamentalist Christianity would demand compliance with orthodoxy and police its beliefs, police the tent, and then kick anybody out, who has gone off the ranch. Farewell Rob Bell, and now whoever it is, they give examples of people that are being canceled because they used the wrong terminology or said the wrong thing 30 years ago. And it's fairly fascinating. What did you make of this guy?
I think what I tweeted in response to it when Christian pointed it out to me was, this is stuff we've talked about for years on our podcast. Like, we've been saying that fundamentalism is not limited to extremely conservative Christians. There are plenty of fundamentalists in other groups as well, including progressive secular liberals. And it also fits with what I always quote Paul Tillich, the theologian, who argued that we're all religious because everyone has something of ultimate concern. And you see that even among secularists and atheists. And given enough time, they will organize themselves into very religious categories of thought and action. And that's exactly what David French is pointing out. And by the way, getting him on the podcast, folks, if you guys are listeners and you're on Twitter, David French is pretty active on Twitter. Like, tweet him and tell him that he should come on our podcast. Maybe we'll get enough momentum that he'll respond and be interested in joining us. Don't badger him. Don't be mean or anything. But, gently say, hey, you would really be a good fit for the Holy Post podcast. You should come on.
And we're going to not stop tweeting you until you agree.
That's right.
Andrew Sullivan, his article is actually from 3 years ago, and it was in response. You know who Charles Murray is, Sky?
No. Was he the Mozilla guy?
No. Author, sociologist, social commentator, very controversial because he co-wrote the book with a Harvard professor, The Bell Curve, about 20 years ago. And The Bell Curve, among other things, posited that there are differences in ranges of IQ that may have genetic between ethnic groups, that may have some social explanation, but some genetic explanation. And that led to a lot of racists picking up that chapter in his book and saying, see, that's why white people should be in charge, because we're genetically smarter. So Charles Murray became very controversial based on that. His next book was the book Coming Apart, about which because he realized, wow, I really stepped in it on race with that last book. His next book was simply about the state of working class white America and how it's completely falling apart and has been, over the last.
I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah. So, and this is kind of a famous incident now. 3 years ago, he was supposed to come to a very liberal college and speak about that book. He was invited by a conservative group on that college campus to come and speak about that group. The more liberal elements on that college campus, the student body, rose up against it and basically shut it down by showing up at the event. And then when Charles Murray got up to speak, turning their backs collectively and starting to chant together so that he couldn't speak. And then it got so bad that he and his host from the university left to go to a secret site to try to finish the talk. When they finished the talk, the mob, this angry left-wing mob, surrounded their car and actually physically assaulted them. They tried to leave town to go eat dinner somewhere, and the mob followed them to the restaurant, and they literally had to run out of town. They were literally not literally tarred and feathered, but literally run out of town by an angry, left-wing mob. And so this article by Andrew Sullivan is saying, okay, if this is what's coming, from the far, far left, this is a big problem. And then he compares it in the same way that David French is to the far, far right, and how, because we criticize the far right. We criticize, the far right of Trump supporters and even the far right of Christian conservatives as being anti-science, for example. We don't want science. We just have our beliefs. We have our orthodoxy. So don't give us data, because data, we don't trust it. It's been corrupted by the elites. We don't trust it. So Andrew Sullivan actually quotes part of what the woke, quote unquote, crowd in the Charles Murray protest were saying And at one point they said this: science has always been used to legitimize racism, sexism, classism, transphobia, ableism, and homophobia, all veiled as rational and fact and supported by the government and state. In this world today, there is little that is true fact. And Andrew Sullivan says this, it seems to me, gets to the heart of the question, not that the students shut down a speech, but why they did. He says, I do not doubt their good intentions, but in a strange echo of the Trumpian right, they are insisting on the superiority of their orthodoxy to quote-unquote facts. They are hostile, like all fundamentalists, to science because it may counter doctrine. And they shut down the event because intersectionality, you know, the view that nothing matters more than your position in kind of the hierarchy of oppression, rejects the entire idea of free debate, science, or truth independent of white male power. At the end of this part of the ceremony, he starts describing the protest as a religious ceremony. An individual therefore shouts, "Who is the enemy?" And the congregation responds, "White supremacy." And that's why Charles Murray wasn't allowed to speak about his book about the state of the white working class, because of the orthodoxy being presented by a group of students who've never read the book and had no idea what he even came to talk about. So Andrew Sullivan is rightly pointing out this is a troubling trend. If this is happening more and more on college campuses, which, you know, should be open to debate of ideas. And it's also a trend that we see in far-right media and in, you know, far-right Trump support, where, you know, oh, what happened to Megyn Kelly? Oh, what happened to Shep Smith? Oh, what happened to all these people that were on Fox News, but they criticized Donald Trump and suddenly they're gone? What's going on here? It's the basically excommunication. It's, you know, the Catholic Church saying, nope, you're done. You've crossed the boundaries.
Well, you know what it sounds like to me, both on the right and the left, is what we're watching is the dismantling of the Enlightenment.
Ooh.
And this is very Nietzschean, right? There's no longer truth. There's only the will to power.
Right.
Truth is irrelevant. What matters is power. And if I have power, I can tell you what the truth is. And if I don't have power, I'm going to take it from you. And so there's some accurate critique that needs to be heard about the way science has been used and abused throughout the centuries to justify all kinds of terrible things. You can see science being used to justify racism. It was used to justify enslavement of Africans. It was used in the eugenics movement to justify all those horrors. And yes, science makes mistakes because it's people who are scientists. But that doesn't mean you can just objectively throw out all scientific claim to truth and now it's a free-for-all and it's just my power versus your power.
Right.
Christians have been doing that for a long time. Now you see non-Christians and secularists doing the same thing because it works. And that's a pretty scary world. We as a country, as a nation, coming just off the 4th of July, we were founded on Enlightenment principles. Flawed as they may have been, nonetheless, it was Enlightenment principles, an appeal to objective truth and nature and natural law and the creator and all those kinds of things that imbue us with inalienable rights. These are all Enlightenment ideas. And if you completely throw away that shared basis, we can argue about facts, we can argue about evidence, we can argue about data and what's the right thing to go. But when you say there are no facts, we're in huge trouble. And now you're seeing it on both sides.
Right. David French, so he starts out by talking about this far left fundamentalism, and then he does come back to what he sees in some Trump supporters in a far right fundamentalism, where he says the result isn't just enthusiastic political support, but a sense of identity, fellowship, and religious passion that's syncretistic with Christianity, with Trump serving as the Lord's mighty instrument of justice and righteousness. So he says, secular religion is breaking out across the land, and part of it is this far left secular religion, and part of it is what has become of Trumpism on the far right. Here's what's new, though, he says, it's growing so very dark. We don't need to repeat all the recent excesses of cancel culture to know that many anti-racist progressives are in the midst of a hunt for ideological heretics. And even the oldest sins can't be forgiven. Consider that on Friday, a Boeing executive resigned after an employee complained about an article he wrote 33 years ago opposing women in combat. And if you think religious Trumpism is sweetness and light, you haven't been paying attention. Right-wing Trumpism is trying its best to build its own cancel culture aimed at purging right-wing institutions of anti-Trump voices, or at abusing them and hounding them online and in real life. And then as you go further out to the edges of Trumpism, you bump into the racist alt-right and the followers of Q, which we covered a few weeks ago, a conspiracy theory so bizarre, incomprehensible, and paranoid that you strain to understand how anyone can believe its claims. Yet it's growing in strength, and it occupies a deeply spiritual place in the lives of its inheritance. So he's worried that we're losing
our moral soul.
Our sanity. The more, he says, the more I experienced the extremes of both left and right, the more I felt like words such as illiberal or authoritarian or even religious didn't quite capture the totality of the devotion and the darkness of the worldview. Fundamentalist is a much better match. Our nation's secular revival looks and feels very much like the fundamentalism I've seen with my own eyes. Which, as we've talked about before, is often based on a mistrust of experts, a mistrust of facts, a mistrust of science, and a policing of borders, a very strict policing of borders.
Can I ask you something at
Yes.
this moment? So historically speaking, we have experienced times of fundamentalist ideology. Fervor going far back.
Yeah.
So historically, what broke a culture or a group out of that mindset?
Go ahead, Phil.
I do not know. I do not. I'm trying to think of examples of disaster. There was obviously a fundamentalist stream to Nazism where, we're not looking for facts, we're looking for villains. We're looking for people to blame, and then we're going to expunge our society of those people, that are to blame. And what ended Nazism was just cataclysm, just destruction. So I'm trying to think of other examples.
I think what's really important to recognize here is, America has been uniquely resistant to long-term fundamentalist groups because of our Constitution and especially the First Amendment. We have resisted indoctrination the way that Germany did with the Nazis because of our freedom of speech, our freedom of assembly, our freedom of thought and religion has meant a fundamentalist group in America tends over time to isolate itself more and more and more from mainstream American society, and eventually doesn't have enough influence to persuade the rest of Americans because of, like I said, the First Amendment. So I don't think it's that fundamentalist groups have broken out of their fundamentalism. It's that they've isolated themselves so much for the sake of preserving themselves that they lose influence and get pushed further and further to the margins. That's what happened with Christian fundamentalists in the early 20th century. They withdrew from the power structures of America to await the return of Jesus. They left the academy, they left government, they left entertainment, they left a lot of business. And today they don't have as much influence. And then evangelicalism arose, and we've done all that history before. But I think it's the resiliency of the American model that keeps a single idea from overtaking the whole country. What's a little bit more frightening right now is you're seeing a new fundamentalism arise, but it is taking root in some of the authority structures of the country, including the academy, and in some cases our two political parties. That's a little bit more frightening.
Well, what's troublesome to me is that I grew up believing in a balance of power that always seemed to work out. Eventually it was sort of balanced out. And for the first time in my lifetime, or even that I've read in most recent history, I don't really believe in this balance of power anymore because the way our system of government is arranged. It seems like it takes such a long time for balances to be held in check. And now we have loopholes and get around everything. So now there really isn't a balance.
Well, think about one other example of fundamentalism in American history that I just realized I'd forgotten about, which was the Red Scare of the 1950s and McCarthyism. So McCarthy was a fundamentalist leader saying, we need to police the tent, we need to find the heretics, and we need to burn them at the stake, is basically. And what that took to end was a groundswell that finally led to, the famous quote, "At long last, Senator, have you no sense of decency?" Of people just saying, would you just listen to yourself? Would you just stop and care about people and stop vilifying, your enemies like this? You've gone too far. So, and that comes from, the protections on free speech, the protections on Congress being a representative of all of us, and people standing up in Congress and saying, you're going too far with this.
But you're absolutely right, Phil, but there are two fundamental differences today versus the 1950s and McCarthyism. One, I think a pretty good case could be made that Congress no longer accurately represents the American people because of gerrymandering. So that's a whole nother discussion. And number two, the internet and social media has so fractured our ability to actually have meaningful interaction and conversation in America. It used to just be 3 major news networks and a handful of newspapers. Those were the forums for dialogue where people could gather and hash out their differences.
Right.
Now we don't have to gather with our opponents and hash out any differences. We can just exist in our echo chambers, which only furthers the divide. That's what frightens me today. It's gerrymandering and the breakdown of shared media through the internet. That means that this could spin out of control in a way that didn't happen 50 or 60 years ago.
I do worry about Christians who should, because where David French ends up with saying is, as we look at our faith, he gives examples, multiple scriptural references that talk about the mystery of God and how it's not fully revealed and we can't see all things from our viewpoint. And it says we must approach our faith and our world with a sense of existential humility. And that is exactly the quality that the fundamentalist lacks. It's the fierce existential certainty of the fundamentalists that is so often the root of authoritarianism and illiberalism. And that's really the bottom line, is if we can't stand humbly before God and say, I don't know everything. God knows everything. I do not. I am finite. And so I need to interact with people who disagree with me. I need to interact with my enemies so they can expose to me what I don't know. And so the concern is how many Christians are engaging in fundamentalism, more political than necessarily theological, although we'll do that also. Because we've lost humility, we've lost theological humility, and boy, that's tough, because we're the ones who should be bringing it, the humility, and if we're not, where are we looking for the humility in our culture? So there needs to be, I think, some serious, soul searching within the church to say, when did we become so certain of ourselves, and when did we confuse that with love of God and love of others? And if we can get back to that point, oh boy, we can do some good.
Fear does not often lead to humility.
Fear. What are we afraid of, Sky? What are we so afraid of?
We're afraid of everything, which is why we want to be certain, because we want to be safe. So the more our leaders make us afraid, the more likely we're going to look for a fortress of certainty to protect ourselves. And so I root it back to that. There are so many voices and forces politically and within the church awakening our fears.
Yeah.
And then to turn around and tell somebody who's terribly afraid, hey, you need to be less certain and you need to be more humble and you need to be more gracious. That's not usually what the fruit that comes from fear.
Right. Right. David French ends up by saying, first, we need to reaffirm our nation's commitment to pluralism. I have heard a lot of Christians becoming, I think, less excited about pluralism over the last 20 years because it's, we're not sure if it's good for us, the nation, the church, it's because it's scary. Second, construct and cultivate opposing institutions that model the values of humility, charity, and free inquiry that we seek to advance. So we actually need to help voices that disagree with each other to peacefully disagree with each other. Third, maintain a wide open door to converts. What does he mean by that? for people that we can actually change our positions?
Yeah, I think instead of shaming people into silence, it's welcoming them into fellowship.
He says, and fourth, pray without ceasing for our nation and its people. He says, I've seen many people leave fundamentalism and enter religious communities that were rich with the fruits of the Spirit, including love, joy, peace, patience, and kindness. I have not, however, seen people battered, mocked, and berated out of fundamentalism. Yep. Oh, but it's so much more fun to berate than to love.
I just really, really appreciate his thought-provoking, balanced perspective, challenging both sides in most of his writings recently. And I encourage people to really get to know David French in that way, because I think he's calling us to think outside the box. I mean, as we have here on the podcast for a really long time, think outside the box of the way we've always viewed our place in society as Christians.
Yep. All right, Sky Jitani, do we have a guest?
We do.
That's fantastic. Is it going to be wonderful?
Yeah, really interesting. I think we're talking about neurotheology.
I don't know what that is. I might have to listen.
Yeah, stick around.
Okay, y'all. See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
What is the real problem facing Christians today in America? Some would say it's the fact that we take Jesus too seriously, that because we're so focused on him and his teachings, we're being marginalized by the rest of society, pushed to the edges, and our faith is not allowed to have expression in the public square. I'm not sure that's the case. More and more, I wonder if it's actually the opposite, that the reason so many Christians are being marginalized is because we haven't taken Jesus seriously enough. That's really the essence of my new book, What If Jesus Was Serious? In it, I explore the centerpiece of his most ethical teachings about his kingdom, the Sermon on the Mount, and how for a lot of Christians, we have dismissed these really challenging teachings like forgiving people and loving our neighbors and our enemies, giving to the one who asks, not cultivating anger in our lives. These aren't very popular at all in our culture, let alone among Christians. But what if we changed that? What if as followers of Jesus, we actually began to take his ethical teachings seriously? How might that change our perception in the public square? And could we actually bring transformation to our culture that so desperately needs it? If these are the kinds of questions you're wrestling with, I really encourage you to pick up my new book, What If Jesus Was Serious? It's a bunch of short entries that take you through the entire Sermon on the Mount, and each one includes a visual illustration, a doodle, that captures the essence of the teaching that's easy to share and explain to others. The book is available now in hard copy or on Kindle. Of course, you can order it on Amazon or wherever you prefer to get your books. My hope is if that more Christians start taking Jesus seriously, maybe the rest of our culture will too. What leads to real transformation? For a long time in the Western Church, we've believed that knowledge alone is what will change people. Therefore, if we just learn enough of the Bible, if we just have enough theology, our behavior will be transformed. Well, a lot of us have realized that's actually not the case. And so in recent years, a lot of us have been drawn towards spiritual disciplines, the practices that change our behaviors. And we've come to believe that a combination of knowledge and practice is what really leads to transformation. Well, my guest today has a third idea, another component that he says we've been missing, which is deeply rooted in Scripture and actually even in our biology. Dr. Jim Wilder is a neurotheologian. That was a new term to me. You're gonna have to stay tuned to hear what that really means. But essentially, he's an expert on the intersection of theology and brain science. And in my conversation with him, we talk about what leads to real transformation and how attachment is a critical part of that. Many of the ideas we talk about today can be found in Jim's new book, Renovated: God, Dallas Willard, and the Church That Transforms. I've picked up a copy for myself. I'm already diving into it. I highly recommend it, especially if you are a leader in a church or you're responsible for the spiritual formation of others. There's wisdom and insights here you don't want to miss. Here's my conversation with Dr. Jim Wilder. Well, Jim Wilder, welcome to the Holy Post podcast. Thank you for your time today.
It's great to be here with you, Sky, and talk about interesting stuff.
Yeah, I hope so. You have a new book out, which builds significantly on your friendship with Dallas Willard. And he was a significant influence on me as well. And I have not spent nearly as much time with him as you did over the years. But can we just begin by talking about how your relationship with Dallas inspired you and this book?
Yeah, that is kind of the start of it. I had hoped that he and I would end up writing the book together, but then he passed away during the process. But what we shared in common was a real interest of what it was that made people become the people God created them to be. And so we were having conversations about that topic, in particular, what the subject of maturity meant. And so if maturity means not that you're old, but that you're everything you were meant to be at the age that you currently are. So, a mature apple blossom is different than a mature apple or whatever else. Each age is supposed to reflect something. And really, God meant us to be more than we typically turn out to be. How do we weave together all the natural things that it takes to, just grow up to be human, plus all the extraordinary or supernatural things that God wants to weave into our character? And so he and I would talk about that, kind of from the point of view of failures. He was working with the spiritual disciplines in the church and saying, the church is not creating disciples. The people we have running around here don't look a lot like anything that would remind us of Jesus. And I was working from a therapy point of view, and we were giving people therapy to help them, overcome their problems. And when we got done, people were more stable, but they still looked an awful lot like the same old people. So that was our discussion there.
Yeah, my last conversation I had with Dallas was probably a 2-hour interview I did with him, and it was basically all about why is the church failing to make disciples, which is pretty much the theme of the latter years of his life and a lot of his books and teaching. But you were coming at it, like you said, from a therapist point of view, and you identify yourself as a neurotheologian.
Yeah.
Just define that, because that's a term I hadn't heard before. I'm sure most of our audience has never heard of it. What do you mean by a neurotheologian, and who is a neurotheologian?
Yeah, well, a neurotheologian is someone that works at the intersection of the human physical being and brain, and the theology, what God teaches about it. The first neurotheologian was Bishop Nemesius of Emesa in the year 395, wrote a book on the brain and personality. He's right near the start of things. And so he's one of the first people credited with the idea that the blood is pumped around the body by the heart. So it's very early in it, but he was thinking, whatever this human body is, has got to do what God intended. So the more we understand about how the body works, the better we can understand how to teach it to do what God intends. And so there's been a tradition since then, but mostly it's been restarted, in the previous century, 1900s, where we began to learn more about the brain, and we could actually study a live brain with brain scans. Up until then, you could only study them when they were dead, and it's limited what you can learn about that. So putting it together, if the brain tells us something and the Bible tells us the same thing, it strikes a neurotheologian as this ought to be something we should pay attention to.
So going back to the very early centuries of the church, there was a popular heresy known as Gnosticism, which essentially dismissed the value of the material world and, of course, of our material bodies, and exalted the immaterial, the spiritual. And even in the New Testament, this is dismissed as heretical, even called of the Antichrist, because Jesus, of course, had a body. He came in the incarnation to dwell among us. And there's a validation of human physical existence in the resurrection, the physical resurrection of Jesus' body. But here we are, after dispelling that heresy 2,000 years ago, a lot of Christians still carry that separation of body and spirit, of the material doesn't matter and only the immaterial does. You see it in our emphasis, especially in Western Protestantism, on theology and knowledge as being transformative, but what we actually do physically with our bodies doesn't matter. How did you and Dallas talk about that as a barrier to spiritual formation, this dismissiveness of the physical person?
Well, with Dallas, it was kind of interesting since he has the academic background, and much of the academic psychology is reductionistic. It wants to say you're nothing more than neurons. There's nothing else to you, and to define a human being as nothing more than the neurons or the brain is certainly to miss the point of neurotheology, or what Dallas is talking about. And the other side of it, as you say, is the old Gnostic heresy. And I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a church and had people ask me, what does the brain have to do with being Christian?
That's a sad statement.
Yeah, it is. But you're right, to deny that the brain needs to learn to be Christian would be to, really take out almost all that we have of being human, because the brain is our learning part, right? That's the main thing that learns to interact with God. And it's just that we have not been able, from the theology side of things, to settle on a good model of what a human being is. Going back again to the early days, the Greek philosophers had, these different elements of being human, like the will, the memory, the emotions, and stuff like that. You break people down into all those categories, and then you try to reassemble how do we teach those ideas, those categories to be Christian. And the model never worked very well, but it was all we had. So Dallas is very interested in finding out what is the formative factor. He had a model that's called vision, intention, means, his VIM model, right?
Yeah, I've employed that many, many times.
Yeah. Now the vision, everyone can kind of agree on. We have to have the right ideas, the right vision, the right understanding of things, truth, and all that fits very well on the vision side. The means side is what are the actual practices that we have to go through. But the intention side was always the squirrely one. How do you get people to actually try to do this? Well, what's the motivation? What's what's going to make you run it? And Dallas knew right from the start it wasn't willpower, because there's some people who are very willful, not necessarily any better spiritually than people who can't seem to keep on a straight course for 2 minutes. How do we go about motivating people to want to be Christ-like? And that's where our conversation sort of ended up at this point, that, the strongest motive in the human brain is attachment. It's who we love. That it forms the identity in the brain, it forms our attachments, it shapes our ideas much faster than the other way around. So much more changed by who we love than what we believe. And so that was our discussion that started this book.
Okay, so let's go there, this idea of attachment. But before we get into sort of the neuroscience of attachment and why it's so powerful, where do you see that in Scripture, or how do you see Jesus or the writings of the Bible affirming that view that science later confirmed through study of the brain?
Yeah, well, here's something you have to look at from that perspective. First is what we think of as attachment is a pretty new concept. It's got about 50 years of being around in science. So you wouldn't expect to find that word or that idea in the New or Old Testament, and actually not in most theology either, right? But that connection between a mother and her child, which is kind of what we talk about with attachment, does the Bible talk about anything that nurtures us or connects us? Can a woman forget her nursing child or fail to have compassion upon it? Yes, they might forget, but I will not. I am, and then God says, I am Chesed. This attachment that God forms with us is, and that's been a very hard word to translate, by the way, Hesed.
Right.
This attachment it's permanent. It's full of good things. It's full of loving kindness. It is a source of love to us. It's something that never lets us go. And you begin to take those characteristics and say, what do we know of in the human brain that resembles that? And there's only one thing, and it's attachment love. So when the Bible talks about love and Hesed love, attachment, connection love, something that glues us to God, and there's words that command us in the Old Testament, like the Bechdel tells us that we should glue ourselves to God. Again, in the New Testament, same things. I wonder if God's talking about what he created in the brain. That's where neurotheology goes with it. Would he have created something in the brain that could do what it is he's talking about? Could these old words for love and gluing ourselves to God and faithful attachment actually apply to what we mean by attachment love now? And of course, I tend to think it does.
So then let's talk about what that looks like today, because no doubt a lot of people listening to this have learned a lot of theology and Bible knowledge over the years. Many of them have practiced different spiritual disciplines, and at some point or another, they have felt frustrated at their lack of transformation, that they're still the same old rotten person they always were before. How does neuroscience and this idea of attachment address that lack of transformation?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting, because the brain has lots of different clocks in it and runs at different functions at different speeds. And one of the functions in there that we call the brain's fast track is the one that figures out, who am I right now, and what is it like me to do under these circumstances? And since we seem to always know that when we consciously think, we assume we just know it. It's not something the brain is always figuring out. But in fact, the brain has to figure these things out. And the system that does that is the system that develops around attachment. Who we love becomes the examples that we incorporate as who I am and how I'm to act, and what my food is, and what where I like to go, and how I typically think, and those reactions that come out that we call character. That before we can consciously think of what we want to do, we have this response to somebody or to a situation. That's the one that usually we say is not very Christian, right? Someone does something, we flare up, get angry at them, and we want to say something, and then what Dell's called sin management kicks in. Our slower conscious track says, yeah, you probably shouldn't say that, that's wouldn't look good coming out of a minister, or whatever it is that we use to regulate our character. But attachment actually forms that in babies, and in adults, attachment to our group also forms what's going to be our essential responses to life before we even have a chance to consciously think about what we want to do. So if we could get into that attachment system and switch up who we think we are, we would actually change the way we respond. The problem is that ideas and words don't do that.
It sounds a little bit to me like this attachment language. There is a theological school of thought that goes back probably at least to Augustine, which speaks about disordered loves. Is there some connection there between this attachment idea that it is what we love or what we find our identity attached to, which ends up shaping us and forming us and directing the formation of our character? Is that am I accurate in connecting those ideas, or are they separate?
Yes. No, I think that's exactly right. And you see that trace go all the way throughout the theological history. So Augustine is talking about that back in the first couple hundred years. Then you get about year 1000, St. Clare is talking about it's our loves that form us. You get 500 years back, you have St. Teresa of Avila, and she's talking about our loves forming us and changing our identity and all of those things. And there's a constant witness to that. The problem is that American Christianity and Western Christianity has greatly been impacted by the Enlightenment. Started with I think, therefore I am, and so thoughts got elevated to a rather strong position in culture. Christians, I think, responded by going, well, if thinking and knowing the truth is important, we've got truth for you. So they kind of moved into that. I don't think, a lot of the Protestant Reformation was very much impacted by, we're going to have all the truth and we're going to line it up just right. Then after that, the voluntarists said, well, it isn't what you believe, it's what choices you make. So now we have choice coming in. So believe and choose. And yes, go ahead.
It just seems funny to me that a lot of the Western church is still fixated on knowledge or truth as being the critical transformative component. And yet we exist in a culture that has abandoned that a long time ago. And you just look at the advertising industry, and it's not targeting our intellect. It's targeting our identity and emotions. It's trying to form attachments so that we will then gravitate toward making decisions that they want us to make. So there's this whole world around us that recognizes the reality of attachments and loves and affections, the emotive side of the formative power of the world. And it seems like the church is slow in picking that up, even though it's a deep part of our own heritage, as you just traced.
Yeah, I think if we look at the way that Protestant life in particular developed, which was the persuasion of people about the truth and the good ideas, and even the idea of sola scriptura, which was sort of formative to a lot of that. So only what the Bible says, which by the way now has become a tradition.
Yeah, the irony.
I digress. That has been put so central to how we become Christians and how we stay Christians, that we have always this idea that we have to have the right ideas, or we are going to get in some kind of trouble. And of course, heresy always involves bad ideas, right? But could it also involve defective loves or lack of loves? And what about the church in Ephesus, when St. John is told to write to them that you have all your theology right, but you've forgotten your first love. So all the right ideas without the right love. Again, it's a long discussion in the church, but right now, the more threatened we get, the more we try to depend on being right, as opposed to, well, how do you actually improve your attachment with God? I mean, I like to ask people that question and watch them roll their eyes.
Well, and that's the heart of the most famous love chapter in Scripture, right? 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul says, if I have all knowledge, but have not love, I'm nothing. So let's go there. What does it look like then to incorporate this more accurate vision of the human creature that includes a brain, it includes attachments? What does that look like in spiritual formation to foster a deeper attachment to God rather than just knowledge about him or even practices?
Well, I think, this is actually where Dallas and I would end up having the biggest discussions. Now, practically, now we're talking about the means.
Right.
And Dallas's comment was he's never heard of a theology where salvation involved a new attachment with God.
You write about a soteriology of attachment, which for those without theological vocabulary, soteriology is just the study of salvation. Mm-hmm. The way a lot of us have been taught is salvation comes when you agree to a set of doctrines, when you have intellectual assent to a bunch of ideas that are true or from the Bible or whatever. But you and Dallas talked about salvation being a shift of attachment. So what is that? What do you mean by that?
All right. Well, attachment, if you get down to biological systems, and I take biological systems to be a metaphor for spiritual life, like Jesus talked about your hearing, your eyesight, and things like that. They reflect some kind of greater truth. Attachment is the way your brain finds out what gives me life. So we attach to what feeds us. That's how it starts for every child, for every animal. You want to get your dog to attach to you, you got to feed it. You don't give it food and water, that dog is not going to attach to you. And same with any living creature. It's what gives us our food and water. So in one sense, you could look at the original sin as letting the wrong person feed us. And you would anticipate that if feeding you was very central, that central to most worship service, there should be some meal or some feeding of people. The God, when he came to earth, would say, I'm like bread for you. I'm the bread that would give you life, or I'm the water that would give you life. And only thing is, he actually practiced that in relationship to other people. So now we have life-giving relationships. The thing about attachment is it takes it out of the area of ideas as the central part and takes it into how's my relationship to you. So if I'm real happy to abuse you but tell you the truth, I'm not actually very life-giving. Making you make better decisions doesn't necessarily mean that I care about you more deeply. One of the things I did as 40 years as a counselor, I saw the children of a whole lot of Christian leaders. And I would describe the ones that came to see me very often as sort of like prize-winning cows. They've been raised with all the right food and the right diet and the right schools and the right injections, but no one had actually ever enjoyed them. No one had ever looked at them and go, wow, you're super cool. I just enjoy who you are. And turns out that once you get past food, the next thing that causes attachment is joy. You will attach to whoever it is who really is just super glad to see you. So when Adam is put in charge of the planet, he's told to serve, protect, and enjoy the planet. And very often, within ministry, we serve, protect. We never get around to enjoying.
You have a statement early on in the book talking about your own practice as a counselor, where Dallas challenged you that people only really change when they're loved. And you had been trained as a counselor to detach yourself from the subjects that you were counseling. But he put in there that, no, you actually have to care about these people and love them. And I know there's plenty of people in ministry, especially pastoral ministry, they might give lip service to the idea of I care for these sheep, or I love my people or my congregation, but for self-defensive and protective reasons, they distance themselves from the people. They don't want to become in any way emotionally attached to them. And then we wonder why real transformation isn't seen. So what does that mean to actually, it's one thing to love and care for our own children, but Dallas went on to say that the true mark of Christian maturity is to impulsively and instinctively love even your enemy. So where does attachment fall for the people that you aren't naturally biologically inclined to attach to, who aren't our own children, for example, or family?
Yeah, well, this becomes a very practical question. And I guess the way that the brain would answer it first, we'll start with that, is what's called acquired value. Now, when you attach to someone, let's say you were to get married, that person that you marry comes with a whole family that you've never seen or met before, and might even not be inclined to have a relationship with. But because they're attached to someone that you care about, they acquire value to your mind that you begin to want to form a better attachment with them. So we're already pre-wired to add people on because someone we care about cares about them as well. So we'll go back to even pets. If a dog runs up and you say, oh, this is my dog, I'm more inclined to like that dog already because it's your dog than it was. That is, if I like you, if we're not getting along, right?
I suppose it could work in the opposite way, right? If you really don't like someone.
It actually does. And we could talk about what enemy mode is doing. The brain's opposite of attachment is enemy mode. So you're not one of my people, you're one of my enemies. And we can pass on to others the dislike of people groups, whole, enemy groups, because they're not my people. But now here's the thing. If we begin to attach to God, who are God's people?
All the people.
Aha. So the closer
those made in his image, right?
Yeah, the closer my attachment is to God, when I begin to look at anyone new, I say, oh, there's one of God's children. I remember being sent one time invited to talk in Korea. Now, I'd never been to Asia before, and so these, the culture, everything was very alien to me, and I'm over there, I think, to give a lecture on addictions or something like that. And I remember my computer shut down in the middle of my first presentation. It thought it was update time because I'm on the other side of the world.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so it's like, it's updating and I can't run a PowerPoint or anything. What am I supposed to do? And I remember the Holy Spirit whispering to me, you're here to meet the family you've never met before. And that completely reconfigured my view of why I was on this speaking tour, you see. Yeah, you mean these are my people? We've never seen each other before. But if we've got the same God, then somehow or another, how he sees you has to become real to me. How he cares about you becomes closer and closer to my authentic first response to other people. It's like, oh, look, God's brought another of his children around here for me to meet. Let's have a look. We're curious. We're interested. We're engaged. If that's how God feels about you.
So that makes me wonder, does it work equally the other way? So you talked about the more I attach to God, the more positively inclined I will be toward people who I see as his children, who are made in his image. Does it go the opposite way, where the more attached we are to godly people, the more attached we become to God himself, vicariously through them?
That, I think, is exactly the point, that the system will work both directions. And in fact, one of the things that we often did in counseling was we basically lent our attachment to God to someone who was coming in who didn't like God. So, well, yeah, I understand. You've been abused by religious people, and you don't want to have anything to do with them or their God. I understand that, yeah. But as they saw, a good relationship forming with us, they would begin to say, yeah, if God's anything like you, and of course inside you go, oh, girl, and I've done such a lousy job, but if he's anything like you, I might like him. And so this is actually not only the case, but when we're upset, we often have a very hard time drawing close to God when hard things are happening. And during those times, when we're in the company of other people who like God, we sort of borrow. It's sort of like my signal is out, but I can borrow your Wi-Fi. Your connection with God reflects on your face and comes over to me with I think God does care about me right now.
Yeah, I love that idea. The story that I've used to illustrate that when I've been in a teaching place has been where John the Baptist is in Herod's prison, and he sends his followers to Jesus saying, are you really the one? And Jesus sends them back saying, tell John what you've seen. And of course, they'd seen all of his miracles and teaching. And it was his way. First of all, he does not condemn John for his doubt and his questioning. He's in a really dark, terrible place, but he basically sends his friends back to him and says, let John borrow your eyes, help him see what he can't see right now. And it reminds me of why we are called to gather together, that we might encourage each other because we need one another's help when we're in those darker places. Before we wrap up, any final advice to people who resonate with what you're saying, who want to foster that deeper attachment to God? what do they need to perhaps include in their life or remove from their life that's going to help their brain form that attachment that may be weak or even non-existent?
Well, the thing that we need to remove, most of the spiritual disciplines are pretty good at removing stuff that shouldn't be there and creating some space for God, but they're not particularly designed directly to create that attachment with God. So the number one thing that forms attachment with God is actually thankfulness or appreciation. Every time something good comes your way from God, make a point to thank him about it, and then tell somebody you know how grateful you are. And now that thankfulness spreads to the work around, the people around you. I think there's one other thing I would tell people, and that is that the relational system that runs your identity in your brain has a firewall in it. That is, it won't let your identity change unless you have an attachment to the person who you're interacting with. So if we have a problem, some area of ourselves that needs changing, we actually need to have God's presence, either through another person or through God directly, be available for us right when we are having our hard time. So the thing that we typically do as religious people is we hide our hard times from each other. So we never have this attachment, and it's because we think this whole Christian thing is not about permanent attachments. If you don't like what you see, you'll dump me. But all attachments for the brain, and I think for God, are meant to be permanent. If we are becoming a permanent people, then if I see you struggling, having a weakness, my inclination is to bring God into that moment of weakness with you. And if we have a permanent relationship, you'll let me do that. And if you're afraid I'm going to get rid of you, if you find my flaws, then we're not going to. And I think that's one of the problems with the American church. We have these temporary relationships. We can come and go from any fellowship at any time, and nothing was built. So, the thing that Dallas told me about loving people, well, loving people builds a permanent attachment with them, which wasn't what I was told counseling was about, but it is what the church is about. So if we start thinking about that, I think, and even talking about it, I think we'll do a lot better.
Sounds like you've just laid out a really good argument for a covenantal view of marriage as well. That safety within which honesty and vulnerability is not condemned, but welcomed, so that real transformation and growth can occur. Jim, I could talk to you all day, because I feel like I'm talking to Dallas again about really wonderful matters. So thank you for bringing his voice to us again. Thank you for bringing your own insight into this area, which we so desperately need. I think there's a lot of us in the ministry world who recognize that our normal forms are not effective. There's something deficient and missing. And Dallas was a great prophet in helping us see what those were. And you're continuing that by giving us even more insights and tools to move us along. So deeply appreciated. And I recommend everybody go pick up your new book. Of course, read the classics that Dallas wrote, but there are now many of us who are his disciples. So grateful that you're among them.
Indeed. Thank you for having me here. It's been a delightful discussion. And like you said, we could go through a number of meals talking about these things together, couldn't we?
Yeah. And I hope maybe we get the opportunity to do that sometime. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistance by Sean McDuffie, edited by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news.